but we'll see what this class looks like. So I'll record this one as well. Okay, so just for a review, what we covered last week was strategic human resource management. And the main idea here with strategic human resource management is just a recognition that your employees are your organization's most valuable resource. It's people that generate the most value for a company. And so given that fact, you want to be strategic. You want to plan a strategy around recruiting, developing, retaining your workforce and making sure that they are effective. And so we covered a few topics related to that. We talked about recruitment. We just ended by talking about compensation. And then in the pre-recorded section, we talked about orientation and learning. And really the main idea here is that you want to get your newly employed workers off to a good start. So you'll go through an orientation process with them. But also, in order to maximize the value that you get from your workers, you want to make sure that they are plugged into an ongoing system of development. You want to make sure that they're constantly improving on their skills so that they're increasing the value that they bring to the organization. So that's the learning aspect of it. Performance management is the idea of making sure that they are on track, right? That they are doing the tasks necessary to achieve the goals that you set out in the company's strategy. And one of the things I think that's important to take note of is effective forms of feedback. Doing performance appraisals, right, where you meet with workers can be awkward for both parties, for both the manager that's delivering the performance appraisal and the worker that's receiving it. Because often you want to close any gaps in performance that they may have. And so often what those sessions turn into is a critique, a criticism of workers' performance, and it just sort of leaves everyone in this like negative headspace. And so a lot of companies have sort of abandoned it because they just think it breeds a negative environment, but I don't think that this is the right approach. If you use effective forms of feedback and appraisal, they can be very positive. And the way you do that, as I mentioned in the pre-recorded lecture, is just to take more of a coaching approach to performance appraisal. So I went into that a little bit, and then we mentioned a few other issues, labor and legal issues, and that comprises all of what we talked about in the strategic human resource management topic. So then today, we're going to talk about, again, how to generate value from workers. And so we're going to talk about creativity and innovation, and we're going to talk about the changes that companies face and the changes organizations need to make in response to that. And so that's on the agenda for today. So creativity, what is creativity? Creativity here is defined, and this is a leading, Amadali she's a leading scholar on creativity. The working definition that I think a lot of scholars adopt is that creativity is the production of ideas that are both novel and useful, right? And so the two key features here, in order for an idea to be creative, is it has to be novel, so it has to be unique, and it has to be useful in some way. And creativity can come from individuals or it can come from groups of people. And then innovation is just the implementation, the successful implementation of creative ideas within an organization. So if it's something that works for an organization and you're able to adopt these creative ideas, that's what innovation is. And so In the next slide, I'm going to talk about actually the process of being creative, like what it takes to be creative. But before I begin that, let me, and to illustrate how to do this, if you all recall, I think in the first lecture I mentioned that I used to be a musician. And so, you know, producing music, playing music, that is sort of a creative act. I've written songs. And so creativity is something I've thought a lot about in my life. This is not my research focus, so I'm not technically an academic expert on the topic, but it's something I have sort of a lot of experience with. And so let me begin by asking, do we have any musicians in our class? And in particular, anyone who has written a song? No musicians? No songwriters? So that's okay. I wish. Well, here's the thing. So your wish may come true, because I am going to reveal the secret, not only on how to write a song, but how to write a great song. I'm going to reveal that in the next slide. How to write a hit. I'm going to give away all of the trade secrets. But first, let me start off by explaining that musicians often don't understand, even the most creative musicians don't often understand what it is that they're doing when they're being creative. And so when you ask musicians to describe the process that they use in coming up with, you know, these great songs that they write, it's very difficult for them to articulate it. And often, there's so many times I've seen interviews with musicians where they're describing sort of the process, and they'll talk about things like, well, they draw inspiration from certain artists, right? And so like a modern artist would often say things like, you know, my parents were really into, like, let's say, I don't know, the Beatles or Jimi Hendrix. And so I would grow up listening to these bands. And so I sort of draw inspiration from them. And this is the things that they would say. And I've heard this so many times when they describe, you know, how they write their music. But then when you listen to their music, I don't hear like anything that has to do with the Beatles or anything that has to do with Jimi Hendrix. And so, you know, it seems as if they're not very clear on exactly what way they're drawing inspiration from them, and maybe how that manifests in their songwriting. So we've actually discussed decision-making in the past, and we've discussed ways in which people make decisions, right? People behave in ways that it's not clear, it's not easy for them to articulate. And do we remember the name that we used, the word that we used, the concept that we used to refer to this process of making decisions when it's not clear exactly how you're arriving at those decisions? Does anyone recall?
Intuition.
There we go, exactly. And so I think that most musicians rely on intuition when they are being creative, right? It's not clear to them exactly how they're coming up with new songs. And I think a lot of musicians like this. They like the aspect, because a lot of people think, since intuition is not easily explained, that they're tapping into this sort of mystical force, right? And so I think perhaps musicians like the idea that maybe they are, you know, tapping into some sort of supernatural power that they derive all of this creativity from. So there's not an effort maybe on their part to really learn what the mechanisms are that produce creativity. But I'm going to reveal to you what those mechanisms are and exactly how you can be creative, because not because I want to turn you into songwriters, although you can use it to write great songs. But this is an important skill you need to know as a worker. This is the way in which companies are innovative, and this is the way for you to generate a strategic advantage. So the process of being creative is something called bricolage. Bricolage in particular, and so the definition that I offered up here in the citation I give has to do with research related to entrepreneurship. And so it just describes the process entrepreneurs use in coming up with new business ideas. But this can be used for anything that's considered creative, including music. And so we'll continue with the music example to illustrate how the creative process works. But bricolage is defined as combining resources at hand in new ways, adding variation, and applying them to new problems and opportunities. And so the idea, so what being creative is you're drawing from things that you know in the past, and you're just combining those things that you've encountered in the past and maybe adding some variation, but those combinations is what makes something unique. And so if you want to be creative in writing a song, the process for doing that is pretty simple. The way you do that is as you listen to songs, there's lots of different elements. You don't need to be a musician, I don't think, to understand this, hopefully. But there's lots of elements that go into making a song. Some of those elements are things like chord progression, melody, maybe a guitar riff or a keyboard riff or a bass riff, synth sounds, different like production elements, maybe the reverb that's added to a vocal, different kind of harmonies that are produced on a vocal. These are all the different elements that go into making a song. And so if you want to be creative and you want to write a song that's great, the way you would do that is as you listen to songs that you consider great, songs that you love, you would take note of the elements that go into that song. So maybe it's the chord progression that you like about that song. Maybe it's the particular synth sound, right? Maybe it's the melody that you hear in that song, right? And you take note of that. That's sort of part of your inventory of ideas that you're going to draw from in the future. And then you listen to other songs, right, that you might like. So in one song, you might like, you know, the bass riff. In another song, you might like the synth sound. In another song, you might like the chord progression, and another, etc. And you would take all of those elements that you like in all of these songs that you hear, and you would combine them into a new song, right? And so that would be the process for being creative in songwriting. And of course, you might add variation to that, right? So there may be a, you know, like a bass riff that you heard in or a bass progression that you heard in a song, and you'll draw from that. And so you'll make use of that bass progression in the song that you're writing, but you improve upon it a little bit. You know, maybe if it did this sort of change, it would sound even better, right? And so you would add variation to it. But that's essentially the process of being creative. And so like when people say, oh, they draw inspiration from like the Beatles or something like that, if that's true, and I think that that might be a good way of being creative, there's something about a Beatles song that you need to borrow from in order to really be drawing inspiration from them. And there's something particular about Beatles music that, like, you know, makes it different than, let's say, trap music, right? And so that element, whatever it is that makes a Beatles song, and it could be any one of those elements, right? It could be chord progressions, and typically like in the 60s, they use very sophisticated chord progressions. So I think that that's one of the aspects that makes a Beatles song, but also vocal harmonies. You will borrow from that, right? And so perhaps a modern artist that is genuinely deriving inspiration from, let's say, the Beatles, but it's writing contemporary song, right? So let's, I don't know, a trap song, right? Then they may combine what you would typically find, let's say, in trap music, which highlights the hi-hat of all instruments, which I find very funny. But you would combine, you know, the hi-hat riff that's typical in a trap song with the complicated chord progressions that you would find in, let's say, a Beatles song. So anyway, so that's the process of creativity. And this same process can be applied to anything that you want to do in being creative. This is the rational approach. This is the non-intuitive approach to being creative. And just adopting this approach, I think, can make anyone creative. It's just a matter of, as you know, whatever it is that you're interested in. It could be. It doesn't have to necessarily be you being an artist, but if you were an artist, right, this is the way you would write a song, or if you're, let's say, writing like a novel or something like that. As you read other novels, take note of the elements that go into that novel that you find appealing. So you can apply this process really to anything. Most importantly for this course, you can apply it to business. And an example of that might be George Schultz, who was the founder of Starbucks, talked about the inspiration, where his inspiration came from in founding his coffee shop chain. And it came from, he describes it as he went to Italy and he saw all of these little sort of mom and pop coffee shops, and they were everywhere. There was thousands of them, and he just liked that idea, right? And so he drew from that and come up with his idea for Starbucks, but he added variation. And so he focused on the customer experience when they walked into his coffee shop. So there's a very particular experience that you're exposed to as a customer. There's smells, and it's all very deliberate and orchestrated in a particular way so that your senses are bombarded in a particular way, right? So with sounds, he's very particular about the music that gets played there. He doesn't stock foods that would interfere with the coffee aroma, right? And so this is the way that he was being creative. He drew from his experience in traveling through Italy. And so in business, you want to take note of other things that companies are doing that you like. And you don't need to be like an expert in business. All you have to do is be an informed consumer, right? Take note of the products that you consume, the products that you use that you like. Why is it that you like them? What are the aspects of these companies that you find appealing? And these are the things that you can draw from in solving future problems in companies that you may work for in the future. Like an example, in my own experience, so if you recall, when I talked about sort of my past, one of the companies that I owned was a concert promotion company. And I started that company in response to my experience touring as a musician. But when I was younger and in high school, I would, go ahead, I think we have a question. No, I don't know. Maybe that was a mistake. Anyways, yeah, feel free to just chime in if you have any questions. But so when I was younger, I actually played in my high school, and lots of high schools, and it was very well attended. It was sort of like a big event, right? When like the students of a high school like form a band and you know they're playing music or whatever. And so whenever we do a show, it'd be very well attended. And lots of high schools have pretty large and pretty good facilities for hosting events like concerts. And so when I eventually went on to become a concert promoter, one of the ideas that I came up with was putting acts who were still at the sort of club level, and you can divide acts into the kinds of venues that they play. And so new acts would typically be at the club level, and that would be any kind of venue that's typically less than 1,500 seats. And then after that would be the theater level. But acts that were touring at the sort of club level, maybe they had their very first sort of hit. And so they haven't really exploded yet. instead of putting them in clubs, one of the ideas that I came up with was make use of all of these venues in high schools. And the idea here was that when you get a nationally touring artist to play at a high school, it's going to draw almost everyone from that high school community to go and attend the show, even if they weren't really a fan of that band. And so if they were playing at the local club, they may be less likely to attend because they're just not huge fans. But if they're coming to your school, right, if some famous artist is coming to your school, you don't want to miss that, right? And so you can generate a lot more attendance by doing that. And so this was drawn from my own experience playing as a musician and recognizing that that's an opportunity. So it's just taking note of things that that you find appealing, that you find that work well, and just sort of keeping running mental notes of those ideas, or even write them down. I mean, as an entrepreneur, I'm constantly writing ideas down, and then you can combine those in new ways, and that is the process of being creative. So, do we have any questions on being creative? Okay, good. Yeah, so hopefully that was clear. So hopefully you all can now go out and write hits. And again, this lesson, I was going to say free of charge. It's actually not free of charge. You're paying a lot in tuition to get these lectures. But look, if you do go on and generate hits, maybe cut me in on some of those royalties. That's all I ask for. All right, is that a deal? Deal. Excellent. Thank you. Sure. Okay, so why is creativity important, right? Well, for one, you want to become a superstar musician, but other than that, the reason why is because we live in a world that is constantly changing, right? So the programming gods did not create a universe that is static. No, we found out that this is an ever-changing universe that we inhabit. The world is constantly changing. Not only is it changing, but it's changing at an ever-increasing rate. And that creates lots of uncertainty, and that requires organizations to confront that change, to adapt, and to not remain static themselves. And so it's going to present challenges, it's going to present problems, it's going to create an environment that's very competitive, that requires you to constantly innovate in order to remain competitive. So being creative is what makes companies innovative, and innovation is what's required in order to maintain a strategic advantage, a competitive advantage within an increasingly, changing environment, and it's a way of confronting problems that your company will face given the amount of change. One of the sources of that change, we talked about last week, GPT-3. I don't know, so since we've talked about it, I've actually seen a lot of videos that give demos of GPT-3. If you haven't seen that, check it out. It will blow you away. GPT-3, just to refresh your memory, is an application that was generated by this organization called OpenAI, founded by Elon Musk and some other people. And they created what's very close to a general artificial intelligence. So a computer application that has general intelligence, that has intelligence on lots of just, topics, or in almost any topic. And so you can converse with this application in the way that you can converse with a human being. And so it's approaching the capabilities of a human being. And so you should check out the demos of it. I think it will blow you away. This is going to radically change the way businesses do business, right? This is because this is something that every company is looking to adopt to improve their operations. It's going to change the nature of work, right? When you have a computer application that is just as smart and just as competent and has the cognitive skills, the thinking skills of a human being, that leaves a lot of what we do redundant, right? And so it's going to be a change in the employment landscape. All of these sort of forces are requiring companies to be, increasingly innovative, and innovation requires creativity. These are some of the other, so I mentioned AI. I think that that's a major force that companies will need to contend with. Here's a list of others. These are sort of general forces that exist, that are not going away, that drive a lot of the change that companies are currently experiencing. So just as an example, more competitors offering targeted products requiring faster speed to market. It used to be the case that companies would produce these sort of mass market products and consumers just had to accept these very sort of general products that companies would produce. And companies were not required to do a lot of customization to satisfy the niche demands and needs of different consumer segments. But that's all changed. I mean, the production capacities enable companies to really customize their offering to ever smaller niches of consumer demands. And so that is radically changing companies. That means you're constantly updating what it is that you offer. You're constantly improving your line of offerings to satisfy more and more consumers. That's one example. Offshoring is another. We live in a global connected world. The world is now very small, so it's a very sort of relatively simple process for a company to set up operations throughout the entire world. And so companies will take advantage of different local markets that may offer favorable conditions in particular areas. So wages are very different throughout the world. And there are countries outside of the United States where wages are a lot lower, so companies can save on their employee expenses. And so they'll move operations to these lower wage countries in order to save on employment costs. Their regulations may be different in other countries. We have a lot of regulations here in the United States. Companies who want to avoid those regulations, often they go into these other countries where maybe they can, maintain operations that perhaps are not as safe or not as environmentally clean, things like this. But this affects, the competition, right? And so all of this is changing, regularly changing the environment in which you have to operate. So there's a list here, all of which are important. Another way of understanding the forces that exist that are driving the changes that companies need to respond to is in this diagram. So you can sort of categorize them as outside forces, forces that exist outside of the company, and then forces that exist inside of the company. So an example of outside forces, and I think we've actually talked a little bit about this in a previous lecture, is changing demographics. So we know in the US is becoming increasingly diverse, right? And so this is requiring companies to change, right? And so they now have to appeal not only in their products and services to people of different cultural and ethnic backgrounds, but they also have to do that within their organization. They have to create work environments that recognize the different, cultural and ethnic backgrounds. Age is, the age of the workforce is changing. Millennials, I think, now represent the largest category of workers. And of course, technological advancements, AI is an example of that. That's changing the way companies, operate their businesses. It's having a massive impact, but also in machinery, automation capabilities, things like 3D printing. These are all rapidly improving technologies that are radically changing the way work gets done. And so this is, forcing companies to have to deal with these changes. Inside forces are things like job dissatisfaction, absenteeism. So they go hand in hand. But if you may have a company that is for whatever reason, is producing a work culture that's maybe toxic, and that's increasing the dissatisfaction felt among employees. And that's going to lead to an increase in turnover, right? They're going to quit. It's going to lead to an increase in absenteeism. So that's something that would need to be addressed. So in the face of all of these changes, companies have to respond. And you can categorize those responses into sort of two buckets. The reactive change would be one way in which a company will respond to change. And that's when the problem already presents itself. So a problem happens with a company and they have to change in order to fix that problem. That's a reactive change. And so the example that your textbook gives is with BP Oil. So BP Oil, a few years ago, many years ago now, I think, they maintain oil rigs out in the ocean. And right, so they're drilling oil from sort of the ocean floor, and they had this oil well that didn't have some sort of part that wasn't required by our regulations, but it's a part that's important enough that even though it's not required by regulations, other companies use this part in their well, and this part was sort of like a backstop that would prevent an oil leak. And so they didn't use this part. It was, I think, is a part that cost something like $500,000, which is, it's not very expensive when you think about the amount of revenues that are generated from any one of these wells. These are, billion-dollar structures. And so they had an oil leak, something happened with their well, and it was spewing millions of gallons of oil into the ocean, and it wrecked the entire, and this was off the coast of the United States, and it wrecked the ecology, right? It killed all sorts of animal life, it killed birds, it ruined businesses who operated on the coast, either as like a tourist destination or fishermen that would use the waters, right, to catch fish, right? So because it sort of, ruined the water in that area, it impacted just so many people. They wound up, so that's a problem that presented itself. And their change to that problem was reactive, right? They only made the change, and the change that they had to change the way they do business. And that change was only made in reaction to the problem that presented itself. They wound up paying like tens of billions of dollars, I believe. I forget what the total number, but it was a very large number because of such a large impact that they had. But they could have been proactive, right? They could have spent, instead of spending tens of billions of dollars and really destroying their reputation as a responsible oil producer, if there is such a thing, they could have been proactive. They could have spent 500 grand on this part and prevented all of that from happening. So the alternative to reactive change is being proactive. And that's, trying to understand what's happening in the world, seeing what problems may present themselves in the future, what changes will impact you in the future, and being proactive by planning for them. One example would be, and this is another example that they give in your textbook, is so this country has gone through a series of mass shootings. These mass shootings often happen within schools. And so it's really brought up the whole debate over gun regulations and gun control. We had in this country, we have, as most of you know, this sort of deep culture where there's like a love of guns, and they see it as something important to their identity, important to their identity as Americans, as a symbol of freedom. And so it's not easy to change gun regulations in this country. And so it's an easy process to get access to guns. And so one of the problems that's causing is there's lots of shootings in this country. So what some companies have done, given the problem that exists with mass shootings in this country, is they were more proactive, and they made the decision that even though it's legal to purchase guns and sell guns, they're going to perhaps take a moral stand and not sell guns within their stores. And so Walmart made that change. In these areas, I don't think they did it actually within all of their stores. But in those areas where they experienced these mass shootings, they no longer sold guns within their stores. CVS is another example. They made the decision not to sell cigarettes, that they view themselves as a health company, even though they made a lot of money selling cigarettes. That runs sort of counter to the type of company that they are. And obviously cigarette smoking is a major health hazard in this country. It's a public health issue. So they were proactive. They made the decision, we're not going to sell cigarettes. So that's a way that those are two ways in which a company can respond to the changes that they experience. Another way, though, of understanding the kinds of changes that happen, this is a model of change that looks at change according to two dimensions. And those two dimensions are, on the one hand, the degree of complexity, cost, and uncertainty regarding the change, and the degree of employee resistance. And so these three, so you can categorize all the kinds of changes that you would want to make within your company in response to the changes as experiences in the environment along these three categories, right? And so adaptive change would be the least complex, the least costly, and that produces the least uncertainty. So then there's the lowest degree of employee resistance in these kinds of changes. And an example of this would be anytime you reintroduce a familiar practice. So an example of this would be if you have an organization, let's say that we have the holiday season coming up shortly, right? Black Friday is the Friday after Thanksgiving, where everyone rushes out in a seemingly manic state to purchase the latest whatever that they want to use, that they want to give others as a gift for the holidays. And so in response to that, companies would have extended store hours during Black Friday. They would have particular deals on that day. And so an example of an adaptive change would be reintroducing extended store hours for your retail establishment, right? And so this is something you've done maybe every year. So it's not that big of a change. You're not going to find a lot of employee resistance to that. But if you were to say to your organization, you know what, on Black Friday, we're open 24 hours a day, in order to serve the needs of these manic holiday shoppers. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to adopt 24-hour operations all year round. That's more of a what would be categorized as an innovative change, because you're introducing a practice that's new to the organization, right? That's not something that they're used to doing. And there's lots of retail stores, that have adopted this. And an example, and so you're gonna get more employee resistance when you make that kind of change, a change that is entirely new to the organization. And then in the last category, where you'll find the most resistance because it involves the greatest degree of complexity and cost and uncertainty, is something they call radically innovative change. And this involves introducing a new practice that is new to the industry, right? And so there's plenty of retail organizations that have 24-hour operations. So it may be new to you, but it's not really new to the industry. An example of radically innovative change would be what the automotive industry is experiencing right now with electric cars, right? The entire industry was dominated by internal combustion engine vehicles, right? Vehicles that had engines that ran on gas. But now there's a transformation happening where cars are now becoming electric, and so they run on batteries instead. This is prompting car companies to make radical changes to their production processes. And that's going to generate a lot of pushback from employees. Another area within the automotive industry is automation, right? At some point, cars are going to be fully automated where they're not going to require people to actually drive. You put in a destination and a computer will drive the car safely to that destination. So it's requiring new kinds of processes that your typical entrenched automotive company doesn't have really the capabilities to generate. So those are examples. That's another way of sort of modeling the kinds of changes that organizations will experience. Do we have any questions on that? Any questions on the types of changes that, the way in which that this model organizes the changes that companies would experience? Any questions on automated cars? I think they're coming. I'm looking forward to the day we can have automated cars. I don't know when they're going to arrive. They've been promising it for many, many years now. It's a very difficult problem to solve. So, who knows when it's going to happen. Really what we need to do is fix traffic, but that's a whole other story. Traffic is the worst. Our mass transit system in New York City is actually pretty good compared to other cities, but it's not good overall. It takes me forever to get from Queens to Brooklyn. That shouldn't be the case. Why does it got to take me an hour and a half to get to Brooklyn? But it does, right? It takes forever even to get into Manhattan. Anyways, so we need innovation regarding, I don't know to what degree automated cars is going to fix that. I don't believe it is. There's people who think it will. That's a whole other topic. Anyway, so moving on, Lewin's change model. So Lewin is a social psychologist who studied how people react to changes in their organization. And so we know that change is a regular part of business. This is something as managers you're going to need to cope with. This is something as employees you're going to need to cope with. Businesses are going to constantly change, but people don't like change. And so there's going to be, as we just showed in the previous slide, there's going to be at least some degree of resistance on the part of employees. And so Lewin developed this model for getting organizations to change. And there's really just 3 steps: unfreezing, making the change, and then refreezing. Unfreezing is really just creating the motivation to change. And the way you might do that is by pointing out the flaws in the current way of doing things. And so if you can convince workers that the way things are currently being done is not effective anymore, right? So if you run a hospital and you have nurses who are making use of paper and pencil in the notes that they take regarding their patients, you might talk about all, let's say, the errors that occur in using this sort of analog form of capturing data about patients, that maybe this paperwork might get lost. And so you can highlight all of the errors and the consequences of those errors by using paper and pencils. And you want to get your nurses to adopt a digital version of this, right? So maybe you want everything to be recorded on tablets, and so that you can establish digital patient records. So the first step to this process is to unfreeze your workers from the way they currently do their work. So to get nurses to unfreeze from this old way of doing nursing by, writing things down using paper and pencil. And then the second part is to get them to actually change, is to get them to adopt this new system. And the way you do that is making the barriers to entry as small as possible. So you want to train them, you want to model that behavior, you want to educate them really on the benefits of the new approach, show how perhaps it might save lives, it would improve patient outcomes. And then refreezing is getting them now to freeze the actual new approach that you've adopted. And that really is just modeling the new approach, so making sure that management or senior nurses are using the new system, and then making sure that the nurses are fully trained on this new system. And so that will get them to refreeze in this new approach. And so that's the model that he developed for getting workers to be more receptive to the idea of change. And then finally, and this is the last slide, and we are going to wrap up here, but this diagram is just another way of understanding change. And this is a systems approach to understanding change. And if you recall, in week 2, when we covered theory, one of the theories that we talked about was this systems approach. And to refresh your memory, a system is a set of interrelated parts that work together to achieve a common purpose. And the point of this system, the point of this diagram, is that it can be used to diagnose what to change, and then the levers that you have access to in order to create the change that you want, and ways of understanding what the success might be of that change effort. Now, getting back to what a system is, a lot of, in describing the systems approach, it's really borrowed from the human body. The human body works as a system, so this is often used as a metaphor for different processes that exist that have nothing to do with bodies. So in the human body, right, we have lots of different parts. We have a heart, we have a brain, we have kidneys, and all of those parts, they'll work together. They are interrelated, they impact each other, and they work together to achieve a common purpose of keeping us healthy and keeping us alive, right? And so that's sort of the metaphor that's drawn upon when thinking about systems that have nothing to do with the body. And the main idea, though, that's highlighted is that any change to one aspect of the system is going to impact the entire system overall, right? And so, if you have a kidney that's injured, right, or a heart that's injured, right, that injury and the impact of that injury is not going to be isolated just to the heart alone or just to the kidney alone. It's going to impact your entire body, right? It's going to, so a change in your kidney is going to change your heart, right? So usually problems that people have with their kidneys can cause high blood pressure, it can cause heart failure in the heart, right? So it has this sort of, interrelated aspect to it where any change to one part of the system is going to have this ripple effect. So the idea here is the same is true within an organization. If you do adopt the change, right, you have to recognize that the changes that you make are not going to be isolated just to within that area where the change was made. it's going to have ripple effects throughout the entire organization, right? So changes that you make to people will have a ripple effect on changing the actual organization itself, and vice versa. Changes that you make to the organization will have a ripple effect in changing the people that work within it. So I think that that's sort of the main takeaway here of using the systems approach to understanding change, understanding that there's going to be these perhaps unintended consequences, and you just have to be aware of it, right? You have to be aware of all of the indirect effects that are going to be produced whenever it is that you adopt any kind of change. And the reason why is because everything is interconnected. So throughout that chain, which links all the different parts of an organization, that change will be felt throughout all of those different parts. The other thing is in this chart, you can see in this center graph, they talk about the different elements that you might target in making your change, right? So clearly people, right? So if you need a change in your organization, one thing that you might address is the actual people within it. It seems obvious. But one way you might do that is you might train them on new skills, right? And that would be a way of introducing change. But it doesn't have to just be that. It could be changing the organizational culture, right? And so that would be a social factor. It could be a change in the actual methods that they use to do the work that they do. So there's lots of different points in which you can target in order to create change within an organization. So that wraps up our lecture for today. This chapter was actually a short chapter, and so the pre-recorded will be a little bit brief as well. But before we finish, does anyone have any questions about this, about innovation, about creativity, about the changes that are happening in the world, the changes that you need to adopt in order to deal with those changing environment? No, good. Okay. All right, so we will wrap it up here. I want everyone to have a great weekend, and we will pick it up, of course, next week. I will hang out for a couple of more minutes if anyone has any questions as you leave, but otherwise, have a great week.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. And remember, I want to cut the royalties if any of you go on to make hit songs. Thank you.